Okay, so picking up where we left off in chapter 10, we talked a lot about, the spinal cord. We talked about the neurons. We talked about how neurons send electrical impulses and the change of ions across the membrane. And so today we're going to focus more on the brain and our sympathetic and parasympathetic autonomic nervous systems. And so again, it's going to get a little complicated, but just bear with me because I'm going to try and package it into kind of sections that make sense. The book is pretty good about just talking about, like, our brain is wild, okay? And so it's gonna be a little bit intangible about, like, well, this area talks or does this, and this area does this, but I'm gonna try and package them into systems so that it makes more sense. All right, so first of all, let's talk about the brain stem. So we talked about a little bit about the cerebrum on Friday and the cerebellum, the other two parts of the brain. But now let's talk about the brain stem, kind of another section of it. So the brain stem consists of the midbrain, you can see that in turquoise there, the pons, which is just below it, and then the medulla oblongata, which is going to be below that. And so each of these sections of the brain stem are responsible for different functions in the body. And so remember that this is where the afferent and efferent tracts of our motor and sensory systems switch sides, right? So what's coming from our right side of our body then changes sides and goes to the left side of our brain in this brain stem. And then vice versa, what's coming or going to the left side of our body switches sides in the brain stem and goes to the right side of the brain. So this is where things kind of go like that, okay? So this process of switching sides is called decussation. And that's the word for that. So the thalamus sits right on top of the midbrain. It's not part of the brain stem, but it's actually a part of a division that we'll talk about next, called the diencephalon. And so this is just kind of a reference for where the brain stem might be in relation to other parts of the brain. So the midbrain, which is on the top of the brain stem, it contains sensory and motor tracts, so both directions, and it's related to auditory and visual reflexes. And then your pons contains also the same motor and sensory tracts that are related to the sensations of your face, of your mouth, your ears, and it controls facial expressions. So this is the location that many of our cranial nerves will originate. We'll talk about those cranial nerves in a second. They all kind of come off of this pons area. And then the third part there, the medulla oblongata, is part that attaches the brain to the spinal cord. So it's the bottom of the brain stem before it becomes the spinal cord. So this is where your cardiac center is, your vasomotor center, and your two respiratory centers. So this is the section of your brain that controls your heart rhythm and your blood vessels when they dilate and constrict, and then your breathing rate. So also in the medulla are your reflexes for coughing, for sneezing, for swallowing, and vomiting. Those are all kind of reflexes, right? They just kind of happen, right? So this is another location where some major cranial nerves originate. So let's talk about one of these packages. So the brain's got kind of what I was saying, I want to package these systems into different little compartments. And so the reticular activating system is a bunch of nuclei, so a bunch of neurons, a bunch of the nuclei of the neurons that are scattered throughout the brain stem, and then they extend all of their other parts of the brain, or they extend out to the other parts of the brain and the spinal cord. And so basically this system is responsible for keeping you awake, and alert. So hopefully right now your reticular activating system is working, right? So drugs that depress this system can cause you to fall asleep. So like a sleep aid is going to turn off this reticular activating system. So the reticular activating system receives input from your eyes, from your ears. It filters out insignificant signals, and it's constantly sending signals to the rest of the brain so that you stay awake. So this is including keeping your heart rate and your blood pressure and your posture, your equilibrium all at kind of an awake state, okay? So reticular activating system keeps you awake and alert. So now the cerebellum, so down there on the bottom, the back lower part of your brain. So this is kind of a fist-sized portion of your brain, and it's underneath that cerebrum, and it houses more neurons than the rest of the brain all combined. So most of your neurons are in the cerebellum. So connected to the cerebral cortex by approximately 40 million neurons, the cerebellum receives and processes messages from all over your brain. And so it monitors body movements, it sends messages for balance, for your coordination, for your posture, and it stores the information necessary for muscle groups to work together to perform like smooth and efficient coordinated movements. So when you are learning how to do a particular motor skill, like play your sport or get better at your sport or become proficient at it, all of that kind of gets collected in that cerebellum. And so it allows you to be coordinated. It allows you to have balance. It allows you to coordinate the different muscles that are working together so that you can perform that skill. So it evaluates sensory input, and that's how it also coordinates all that stuff, such as your touch, your spatial perception, and then also sound. So people with cerebellar dysfunction will have poor balance. They will have jerky movements, kind of spasticity, and they tend to overreact emotionally as well, which is interesting. Remember I was saying that diencephalon was on top of the brainstem. Your thalamus is part of it. So now we're going to talk about that diencephalon. So deep inside the brain, which is, you can't really see it, it's kind of down in there, is that diencephalon. And it consists mainly of your thalamus and your hypothalamus. So the thalamus is shaped kind of like two eggs, and it resides on the top of the brainstem. And it acts as a gateway for nearly every sensory impulse that's traveling to the cerebral cortex. So remember, everything's kind of going out to the outer part of your cerebrum, and that's the cortex there. So the thalamus processes and filters all of these impulses. It transmits some of them, but not all of them, to the cerebral cortex. And so the thalamus is also involved in your memory as well as your emotion. And then the hypothalamus is tiny in size, but it influences nearly every organ in your body. So the hypothalamus controls your autonomic nervous system. We're going to talk a lot about that in a second. Your autonomic nervous system is the part of your control that you don't have to think about. It just happens automatically, like your heart rate, your breathing rate, all those things. So it also contains, the hypothalamus also contains your centers for hunger, for thirst, as well as your temperature regulation. So like when you are hot and your body is probably going to respond by sweating, all of that gets processed in your hypothalamus. You're not saying, hey body, sweat now because I'm hot. You don't have to make that decision. It just happens automatically, and the hypothalamus is responsible for that. So the hypothalamus is also responsible for or involved in multiple emotional responses such as fear, anger, as well as pleasure and aggression. Okay, cardiac and respiratory centers are found where? It's in your brain stem.
D, medulla oblongata.
You got it. D, the medulla oblongata. Is it Billy? What movie made the medulla oblongata popular? Some Adam Sandler movie. I don't remember. Where'd my water go? Okay. Cerebrum. So now I'm going to switch over to the iPad here because I think it's a good way to see the brain. But this image is obviously available on the slides and it's available in your book as well. Let's see here. Let me switch over. Okay. So if I want to turn on our nervous system, I'll just click on the nervous system, hit the plus sign one time. I'm not going to overwhelm you with too many nerves. We're just going to look at kind of the first layer of the nerves. I'm going to make this nice and big, and then spin them around. And let's take away some bones. So I'm going to remove this occipital bone. I'm going to hide it. The parietals, I'm going to hide those. And then I'm going to turn it around to the side here. I'm going to hide the temporal, the sphenoid, and the frontal. Okay. So let's just take a look right now at our cerebrum. Remember those meninges, the layers of protective material over the brain? So what it looks like right now is this kind of slimy film over the brain. And so it's going to be that outer layer, the dura mater. And so I'm going to also remove the dura mater. And then underneath it, whoa, that got weird. Underneath it is the arachnoid mater. I'm going to remove that as well. And now we can really look at the brain, okay? So the cerebrum is the largest portion of your brain. It's like when you think of the word brain and visualize what it would look like, you're thinking of this, right? You're thinking of all the wormy structures. And so the cerebrum itself is divided into lobes because it's so big, okay? And they all have different things that they are responsible for. And these lobes are actually going to coincide with the bones that cover them up. So you should know them because you know those bones, right? And so how you can identify where these lobes begin and end is there are some prominent sulci, which are those valleys, those divots between all the little wormy structures, and then as well as some prominent gyri, the raised part, that divide all this up. And so there's one sulci that crosses laterally from right to left over the top, and it's called the central sulcus. So let's look at the top of this cerebrum here. Whoa. Now, there is, if you look going from left to right, there's a big sulcus that goes right over kind of the center of it. Let me see if my finger will allow me to. There it is. Perfect. Here's your central sulcus. So you can see this prominent fissure or valley in your cerebrum. And there's a left side and there's a right side as well. And so this is going to divide the frontal lobe from that parietal lobe. Remember those bones that coincide with that part of your skull? So this central sulcus is going to divide it from the front and the back there. So if I were to just touch the front right here, you'll see this is the frontal lobe. You'll see the parietal lobe. And this is on both sides of your brain. And now you can kind of see where that central sulcus might be that divides the front and the back there. So now the gyri on either side of this central sulcus are actually, they have a specific name as well. you've got your precentral and your postcentral gyrus, okay? And so if you see where the central sulcus is right here, whoops, well, I just touched the postcentral gyrus. Make sense? It's behind that central sulcus. And the precentral would be just in front of it, okay? So there's lobes, you got the frontal and the parietal, and then you got the central sulcus, and then you've got these gyrus that kind of flank that central sulcus. So there's another prominent sulci. If I were to turn and look at the brain on the side, get this oriented. There's another prominent sulci right here called the lateral sulcus. And you can find this because it's going the opposite, or it's actually going perpendicular to all the other sulci that are above it. You guys see that division there? So that's the lateral sulcus. And so the lateral sulcus is going to divide the temporal lobe from all of the lobes above it. So the temporal lobe is going to be down here, okay? Same thing with that temporal bone. And it's going to be just below that lateral sulcus. So let's talk about what each of those lobes are responsible for. So the frontal lobe is, it governs all your voluntary movements. So if you were to get injured right here in the front of your brain, then you may have some issue with talking to your muscles, okay? So this voluntary control of all your movements. Your frontal lobe is also responsible for memory, for emotion, for your social judgment, so your behavior in society, how you make decisions, reasoning, aggression, and it's essentially the aspect of the brain that's responsible for your personality, okay? And this is all part of that cerebral cortex, that outer part of the cerebrum. Now the parietal lobe is going to be concerned with receiving and interpreting bodily sensations, such as touch, temperature, pressure, and pain. And it also governs proprioception. Who can tell me what proprioception is? Yes, it's your body awareness. So like where you are in space. Are you standing upright? Are you touching something? Your balance is all related to this proprioception. It's kind of just this like constant message of where your body is in space. Like what am I trying to think? There's like the circus that travels around or whatever. It's got all the rides and stuff, and they kind of throw you off. Sometimes you might have a little bit of like nausea from, you know, having your equilibrium thrown off. And so proprioception is just really, really gone askew when you get tossed around in those silly circus rides. And then your occipital lobe. We didn't talk about this one. So back there behind the parietal lobe is the occipital lobe. And it's going to coincide obviously with the occipital bone. So if occipital, you know, is kind of related to optic, what do you think this lobe is responsible for? Vision, right? So it's interpreting visual information. It's analyzing that visual information. And so a lot of the stuff that goes from your eyes, all those senses, go straight back to that occipital lobe. Now let's look at the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe is going to be right underneath that lateral sulcus. Now this one is going to govern your hearing, your smell. It's also going to be responsible for some learning and memory, just like the frontal lobe. Emotional behavior and visual recognition. So my friend that lost his sense of smell, it was an injury to the side of his head, and that's where he, you know, it damaged that part.
So is this all gray matter?
Yes, this is all gray matter. Yep. So this will be all part of the cerebral cortex, your kind of higher part of your brain. You got it. Now on this slide, there is another feature in your brain called the insula, and if you were to just pull away that lateral sulcus and just look just underneath it, not all the way deep, there's another section called the insula, And that plays a role in many different functions, such as your perception, your motor control, self-awareness, and then just in general cognitive functions. Just want you to know it exists. All right. So now, let's see here. Am I going to do this one on the iPad? Yeah, let's do it on the iPad. So I'm gonna pull away a whole side of our cerebrum. I'm going to remove the false cerebri. Okay, I'm just going to look at it kind of in a side view here. So the bulk of your cerebrum is white matter, which are myelinated nerve fibers, right? Remember, the white matter is the myelin, or the white color is that myelin. And it's also got the surface, and the surface is that cortex. And so I don't think that the iPad actually, no. I might switch to the slide because this gives you a little bit better view of it. Okay. All right, perfect. Okay. So the white matter is mostly tracts that are going every which way through the cerebrum, those myelinated axons. And then most of these tracts will pass from one hemisphere to the other, meaning it goes from left to right of the brain, and it passes through a structure called the corpus callosum. And so this is the corpus callosum. I want you to think about this as like a bridge. The way I remember this is, does anyone know where Corpus Christi, Texas is? There's a big bridge to take you to Corpus Christi. And I always think of corpus callosum as the big bridge to take me to Corpus Christi. And that, I don't know, just works for me. Sometimes it's hard to remember things, so make silly associations if it works for you. So corpus and corpus, it's the bridge. And so this is the bridges, the left and the right hemispheres of your brain. So additional masses of gray matter, called your basal ganglia, you can see those right there. They're going to be kind of in between the two sides of the corpus callosum. They play a role in your control of movement as well. So I'm going to switch back to the iPad. I'm going to show you the corpus callosum on here. Okay, let's see here. So this blue part is a ventricle. Remember, this is where we've got two lateral ventricles, one on the right, one on the left, that produce our cerebral spinal fluid and allow the cerebral spinal fluid to move around. If I were to take away the ventricle and kind of turn it to the side here, I'm going to see this one side of the corpus callosum right here. Now, if I were to fade others, now you can see where this would reside. This is just one side. There's one on the other side as well. Does that make sense? So this is where information is going to go from left to right. Things are passing back and forth, and they all go through the corpus callosum, but when you're talking about sensations and motor control, they pass left and right through the brainstem. Don't want to confuse you there. Okay. So let's talk about the limbic system. So another one of those packages. We talked about the reticular activating system. Now let's talk about the limbic system. So encircling the corpus callosum and the thalamus within the middle of the brain are some structures that make up the limbic system. And so the limbic system is the seat of emotion. It's the seat of learning. And it links the automatic functions of your brain stem to certain areas in your cerebral cortex. So feelings of anger, fear, sexual feelings, sorrow, pleasure, a lot of your emotions are going to be the result of your limbic system. So associate that. Limbic system are all of your feelers, right? All the feelings you have. And so other parts of your cerebral cortex must also be engaged to ensure that those feelings are expressed in a socially acceptable way, right? If you're pissed, you can't just go running around punching people, okay? So our limbic system talks to our cortex and says, I really want to punch someone right now because I'm angry, and your cortex is like, hey, wait a second, you might get in trouble for that. Let's be socially acceptable. And so this is what's going on here. This limbic system is talking to that cortex going, I'm feeling all these things, and your cortex is like, don't freak out, it's okay, people still like you, okay? So the two key structures of the limbic system are the hippocampus and the amygdala. Let me see if I can dig those out of the brain right here. Let's go back. So I'm going to remove this little piece right here. Oops, not fade, I want to hide it. And I'm going to remove the ventricle as well. And then right here is your thalamus. And so, actually, no, I'm looking for the hippocampus. Gets a little complicated in here. I think this is your amygdala. So there's the amygdala and then the hippocampus. All right. Don't worry about finding it. Just know that your limbic system is it's made up of the two structures, your hippocampus and your amygdala. It's responsible for all of your feelings, and it talks to your cortex, and your cortex tells you how you are supposed to behave according to those feelings and sociable and like what's acceptable in society. Okay. So I'll let you see that slide right there. We'll go back to it. Okay. There's your limbic system. So now the sensory functions of the cerebral cortex. So let's go back to the iPad here. I'm going to try and undo all the way to the let's see here. If I undo everything, I can get my cerebrum back. Yeah, it's going to take forever. Okay. Go to brain. Here we go. Perfect. Okay. So we're going to talk about those prominent gyri that are before and after that central sulcus. So let me turn you back on here. Okay. So that was all the divisions of the brain, and yes, there's specific functions, but those functions are also not absolute, okay? Which is what makes the brain so complicated. So they can vary among individuals, and they can also compensate for each other, say an area is injured. So our brain will actually, like, if one part of your brain that's responsible for something gets injured, another part of your brain will take over and do it for you anyways, because you need that function, right? So the word that's describing this is called plasticity. So your brain is very plastic. So if something gets injured, it can compensate in another section, even if it's not its primary role. So now let's talk about the cortex of the cerebrum. So the cortex, like I said, is your higher functioning brain. This is what separates us from animals. We have this very, very developed cortex in our brains that makes us able to reason and think. And it's mapped out to specific functions. And again, like I said, they can compensate for each other. So let's just talk about sensory functions. So who remembers which word coincides with sensory? Is it afferent or efferent? What's sensory? The direction that we're going from feeling things up to our brain. Afferent. Good. So sensory and afferent go together. Always remember that. Motor, the action of your central nervous system telling your body to do something. What's the name for that? efferent. Good. Okay, so let's just talk about sensory or afferent. And okay, so we've got our central sulcus right here. Spin them over. Okay. And so the postcentral gyrus is the primary somatic sensory area. Okay? So that would be the one that's behind the central sulcus. So this is our postcentral gyri. And so this is sensory, okay? And so it receives impulses of heat, it receives impulses of cold, touch, from all those receptors all over your body. And because of decussation, the right postcentral gyrus receives signals from the left side of the body, and the left central gyrus or postcentral gyrus receives signals from the right side of your body, right? So the somatic sensory association area is going to be all of this behind it, okay? So we don't really have, this is going to be your parietal lobe here, but there's an area in your brain that's back here that coincides with your parietal lobe that is going to be the association area. So you will get, the impulses will get received right here in this postcentral gyrus, then get sent to the association area to kind of interpret and analyze that information, okay? So it's like you got your receiver and then you've got your analyzer. And so the somatic sensory association area allows us to pinpoint that location of pain. It also allows us to identify texture. So if we feel something soft, we'll say soft in our postcentral gyrus, and then our, the association area will be like, I think that's a teddy bear because teddy bears are soft, And so it's kind of this interpretation of that information. It's also what allows us to be aware of where our limbs are, in that proprioception as well. So now let's talk about motor functions of the cerebral cortex. So what gyrus do you think might be responsible for motor? If the postcentral is responsible for sensory, what would be responsible for motor, the opposite side? Precentral, you got it. So boom. Precentral gyrus is responsible for motor function. So the primary somatic motor area is all of that area that's in front of the precentral gyrus. So just like the postcentral gyrus would receive the sensory information and then associate it behind it, the precentral gyrus gets the information from the association area and sends the signal. Got it? Kind of confusing, but it goes that other direction, right? So the neurons in the motor association area, which are going to be up here in this frontal lobe, they're going to determine which movements are required to perform a specific task. They're going to send that appropriate signal then to that precentral gyrus. Whoop. I can't touch the right thing. There we go. And then the neurons in the precentral gyrus are going to send the impulses through all those motor tracts, and then down the brainstem to the spinal cord and out to the skeletal muscle, and then you actually perform the movements. Okay? So precentral is motor, postcentral is sensory. All right, I'm going to go back to the slide now. Okay, another package. A package, system package in your brain, okay? So language, let's talk about language. So it's one of our functions, obviously, and it has a very specific sequence of events that it goes through. So where this is located in your body or in your brain isn't necessarily, I'm not going to ask you to identify, I'm not going to say point to the brain and tell me where the whatever area is. I want you to just really memorize the sequence of events and then the specific names that are associated with those areas. So here it is. So number 1, written words will stimulate that primary visual cortex that's back in that occipital lobe. You see it, right? See the written word. Then there is number 2. There's an angular gyrus that translates this written word into a form that can be spoken. Okay? So it's like this, another interpretation area where it sees it and it's like, I think I know how that would sound. Then you've got the Wernicke's area. It's going to be number 3. And this formulates the words into phrases that comply with learned grammatical rules. So now you're able to put that into a sentence because you have learned how our language works and the grammatical rules that follow our language. And that's where the Wernicke's area does. So infants, when they can't talk yet, but they can hear you. When you are reading to them as they're developing these areas. And so they're starting to log away all of these grammatical rules just by hearing you read to them. It's very important. They're learning language even before they can say, mom or dad. So it's very important. So then next, number 4, you've got the Broca's area, another funky word. So Broca's area plans the muscle movements that are required, such as from your larynx, your tongue, your cheeks, and your lips to actually form those words. So this is going to be motor. So if somebody were to have damage to their Broca's area, they may know that they need to say this word, but they can't get it out because they can't formulate the coordination of those muscles so that they can speak it. So learning another language, you can probably talk about this from personal experience. Like you've learned all your life how to speak a certain way. And then every language is going to have their little idiosyncrasies, right? And how you have to formulate your mouth so that you can make that sound. And it's hard, right? Huh? Still working on it. Juan is doing amazing. By the way, I think you learned English like a year ago? Yeah. So pat on the back there. I couldn't even imagine coming to college not knowing the language. And what?
It was kind of tough.
Yeah, that'd be huge. I mean, we're learning all this other language here, and that's like another language too. It's like language number 3, anatomy and physiology. Yeah, so Broca's area is where you are putting all those muscle movements together to speak the word that your Wernicke's area had created, right? And then number 5, the last piece in the sequence, the primary motor cortex, right? We just talked about this. So it's going to send that impulse to the muscles of the mouth, of the cheeks, of the larynx, of your, whatever, so that you can actually pronounce the word. Okay? So here's your sequence of how we see a word and then speak it. There's a lot of steps in between. Okay. Limbic system, quiz question. It's charged with what? Your feelers, right? Limbic system are your feelings, all your emotions. Good. All right. So A it is. All right. Okay, another system in the brain, a little package, okay? Special senses. So our primary senses of, say, taste, of smell, of vision, of hearing, they're also handled by specialized areas in your cortex. Again, remember this is kind of intangible, but just kind of get a visual of where these things are happening. So here are our regions, starting with the primary gustatory complex. So the primary gustatory complex handles the interpretation and the sensation of taste. So this is like you taste the ice cream and you're like, oh my goodness, that's so good. That is your primary gustatory complex tasting it right there. Next, you've got your primary visual cortex. So this is responsible for what do you think? Huh? Vision, right. Primary visual cortex is responsible for vision. It's responsible for your sight. And it governs the recognition of size and color and light and motion and dimension. And then you've got a visual association area that then takes all that information and interprets it into things that we are familiar with. This is how we go from seeing something to recognizing it. So like our primary visual cortex will see our friend, but then our visual association area will say that's our friend. Got it? There's actually two parts to that. Next, we've got primary auditory complex, responsible for hearing, auditory. And then your auditory association area. Same thing as the visual association area, as this is where it interprets it into things that we recognize and that we're familiar with. Say a person's voice or a song. So the primary auditory complex is going to receive that information, and then the association area is going to go, I know all the words of that song, I'm going to sing it because I just recognized it, right? Then you've got an olfactory association area, and this obviously interprets our sense of smell. Okay, another package. Let's talk about sleep. Brain's responsible for this as well, right? So scientists have learned a lot about our functions, or how we sleep, the functions of our sleep, by studying the changes in our brain waves. So they'll actually hook people up to electrodes, and then watch their brain waves as they sleep. And they go through different stages, and they've identified these different stages by looking at the differences in those brain waves. And so we actually have 4 distinct stages of sleep, and then we've got an intermittent stage that we'll kind of bump in and out of called REM, or rapid eye movement. So let's talk about stage 1. So stage 1, people will awaken easily, and so those brain waves are going to be very active. They're not really calm yet. In stage 2, brain waves show occasional spikes in amplitude, which is a reflection of the interaction of that thalamus and the cerebral cortex. They're talking back and forth to each other. Okay, so we're a little bit deeper sleep, not easily awaken, but slower brain waves, but not completely into deep sleep. Now, stage 3. So this begins about 20 minutes after stage 1. And this is where our brain waves get really rhythmic. And they just kind of go, up and down in a very distinct and even pattern. And so the muscles are very relaxed. The heart rate slows. The blood pressure drops. And we're into more of a deep sleep. And then stage 4 is called slow wave sleep because it gets real slow. It's also rhythmic as well, but it's going to be a lot slower. And so the muscles are very relaxed here, and that sleeper will be difficult to awaken. Does anyone feel like they're a deep sleeper? You just kind of get knocked out. Does anyone feel it change as they age? Like from teenage years to your early 20 years? So a lot of these are going to change, and as you get older, it's going to be harder and harder to get into deep sleep. But it's huge. It's a huge part of your health. So now let's talk about REM sleep. So about 5 times a night, a sleeper will actually backtrack from stage 3 to stage 2, kind of go back and forth. And this is where REM sleep occurs, or rapid eye movement. And so the eyes will move rapidly back and forth, and this is actually when you dream. So REM sleep is your dreaming. Who here has crazy vivid dreams? Yeah? That is such a wild science, like neuroscience and dreaming. Like, I don't understand it. We always try to make rationalizations for why we dream what we dream, but there's probably really no real rationalization for it. So this stage, this REM sleep stage, lasts from about 10 minutes, and it can actually last up to an hour. It's depending on the individual. So it's intermittent. It kind of bounces back between 2 and 3. Okay. Cerebral lateralization. So the left and the right hemispheres are separated by, who remembers what that big, giant, prominent sulcus is? Yes, the longitudinal fissure. That's your right and your left side of your brain. And they actually have their own specific associations as well. And this is what is called cerebral lateralization. So the left hemisphere of your brain is considered more analytical. And so it focuses on language, the types of reasoning that is used in math and in science. It's your analytical brain. And then your right hemisphere is more concerned with creativity and spatial ability. And this is your artsy side of your brain. You got your science and math side, and then your artsy, dreamy side. And the two hemispheres communicate together through the bridge called the Corpus Christi? Right. Corpus callosum. Good, yeah. So these two talk to each other through that corpus callosum. And it actually allows for pretty smooth integration of the two sides. Usually, one's personality is going to have kind of a dominant influence, right? You guys seen that in yourself? Do you find that you are more dominant in the sciencey, math, analytical side, or are you more dominant in the creativity, spatial awareness side? Kind of can think about which side of your brain you feel like you or that influences you the most. It doesn't mean that one side of the brain is undeveloped and the other is developed. It's just that one will tend to have a little bit more influence than the other. When you think about the people in your life, like your closest group of people, think about them. Like, give me some examples. Somebody that you're like, oh yeah, they're totally right-brained. Your mom? She artsy? Yeah, I'm definitely left-sided. I enjoy art, and music and imagination, but I get kind of like, I just go back to like, well, this doesn't make sense. It has to make sense, And so it's just the way everything comes back to my left side. Okay. So there are many, many nerves in your body, and they've been given names. But the cranial nerves are the ones that are key to remember. And so these nerves lead directly from two parts in your brainstem. Who can remember? So there's three parts of your brainstem. Two of them are the original place that these cranial nerves, these specific nerves, will lead from. Who can tell me? Yep. Huh? And the medulla oblongata. You got it. All right. So they lead directly from the brain, and they're very specific in their function. And so they're primarily responsible for your special senses. However, there will be some that are responsible for more like your heart rate and your respiratory rate. So let's see here. I want you to turn to page 188 and 189 so that you can see all these cranial nerves. We're going to write them out. So some of these cranial nerves will only contain sensory fibers. Some will only contain motor fibers, and then some will contain both, okay? And they're going to have a specific name, and they're also going to have a specific Roman numeral that's associated with their name. So let's list them out. And they're going to be listed, they're going to be numbered from the anterior part of your brain back to the posterior part of your brain. So let's write them all out here. Grab a marker. Okay, you tell me. Cranial nerve number 1. What is its name? Olfactory. Good. And this one, is it sensory? Is it motor? Or is it both? Sensory. Good. Sensory. It's responsible for our smell. Now, cranial nerve number 2. What's this one?
Optic nerve.
Optic, you got it. Sensory, motor, or both?
Sensory.
Sensory, good. And it's responsible for our vision. Cranial nerve number 3, what do we got? Good. Oculomotor. Is this sensory, motor, or both? Motor. Motor in the word, right? So this is responsible for 4 out of the 6 eye muscles. You've got a lot of little eye muscles. You can thank me that I didn't make you memorize those as well. Okay, cranial nerve number 4. What's this one? Trochlear, good. And is this sensory or motor or both? Motor. Now this is going to control one of the muscles of your eye. Cranial nerve number 5. Trigeminal. You got it. So the trigeminal actually will branch into 3 branches kind of across your face, hence the word tri there. And so is this sensory, motor, or both? Both. Good. I'm going to say it has 3 branches, and it's responsible for your facial and jaw muscles. Okay. Roman numeral number 6. Cranial nerve number 6. What's this one? Abducens. Good. Sensory, motor, or both?
Motor.
Got it. So this is going to be more muscles of the eye. Our eyes get a lot of cranial nerves, right? Pretty important organ. Number 7. What's cranial nerve number 7? Facial. Good. Sensory, motor, or both? Both. Good job. This is going to be our facial expressions. Okay, number 8. Yeah, vestibular cochlear, or you can call it auditory, whatever you want to do. I'm going to say S-cope or auditory. Sensory, motor, or both?
Sensory.
Good. And what do you think this is responsible for?
Hearing.
Good. Hearing. Good. All right. Number 9. Another big word. Good. Glossopharyngeal. Big one. Sensory, motor, or both? Good. And this is going to control and sense things around your tongue, your pharynx, swallowing, all that stuff. Cranial nerve number 10. This is a biggie. This is one that's really, really, really important. What's this one called? Vagus. The vagus is sensory, motor, or both? Both. What big function does the vagus control? Very important function. Respiratory. It also controls digestive and a bunch of things. Biggie though is a heart. This is your heart rate. Vagus is your heart. digestion, respiratory, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Number 11. What's this one?
Spinal accessory nerve.
Got it. Spinal accessory. Sensory, motor, or both?
Motor.
Motor. This controls the movements of your hands and of your head and your shoulders. Sorry, not your hands. And then number 12, the final one. We've got 12 cranial nerves. What's this one?
Hypoglossal.
Hypoglossal. Sensory, motor, or both?
Motor.
Motor. This allows you to swallow and talk. So it probably works together at that glossopharyngeal. Cool. So these are different. These are not the same nerves that are leaving from your spinal cord. They're leaving directly from your brain. And you can think about it, it's kind of controlling a lot of stuff that's just happening like shoulders up, right? Everything from the spinal cord starts to go down our arms, through our thoracic cavity, and down our legs. Okay. It's freezing in here. Guys, cold? All right. So let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about the autonomic nervous system. So in chapter 9, we discussed muscle contraction and we discussed the nerve innervation of that somatic nervous system. But this division, the autonomic nervous system, is involuntary, okay? We're not making decisions about this one. This one's just doing its job without us knowing it. And so it controls your heart, it controls your digestion, your blood pressure, your glands, all the smooth muscles that are associated with your organs. And it's basically controlling everything except for your skeletal muscle, right? So let's go back and let's just draw those divisions. Let's see here. I'm gonna... Remember we had like the peripheral nervous system, the central nervous system, then all those different divisions. So let's look at just this one division of the peripheral nervous system. We've got somatic, then autonomic, and then underneath autonomic we've got two divisions. What are those? Who remembers? Excitatory and calming divisions. You guys remember those names of those divisions? You got it. Good. Sympathetic and parasympathetic. Which one is excitatory? You got it. So arousal or excitatory, and then the other one would be calming. Okay. So the autonomic nervous system asserts its control through visceral reflexes. We talked about somatic reflexes on Friday when the doctor hit the hammer on our patellar tendon and we moved. But now there's visceral reflexes that are going on as well, not something that we're aware of. And so they're similar to our somatic reflexes, but it affects an organ in our body instead of skeletal muscle. So all the visceral reflexes follow this similar pattern, these steps. So I'm going to give you an example of a visceral reflex arc that's responsible for our blood pressure. So let's walk through these steps. So number one, first things first, we've got receptors that detect a change in the body's condition. And so for the example of blood pressure, we've got pressure receptors that are in our blood vessels, and there's a biggie one in the carotid artery. And these pressure receptors are called baroreceptors. So they're going to sense or detect some sort of change in our blood pressure. Let's say it's detecting a rise in pressure. So then number two, afferent neurons, or sensory neurons, the ones that go from our senses up to our central nervous system. They're going to transmit this information about this change to the central nervous system. And so in this example, the glossopharyngeal nerve is going to relay this information to the medulla oblongata. This is where our blood pressure gets interpreted. So then number three, our brain processes that information, and then it's going to transmit a signal along an efferent neuron, one that goes back out to that organ. So, and again, an example would be your vagus nerve, and this is going to send a signal to the heart's pacemaker, and it's going to ask the heart to slow down. So our blood pressure is high. We want our heart to slow down to find homeostasis. So then the last step, number four, is going to be this effector organ. So in this case, it's your heart. And it's going to receive that message, and it's going to respond by slowing its roll, and therefore our blood pressure is going to drop. So this all happens without us thinking about it, right? So let's quickly review what we know about motor neurons and a muscle. And this would be considered the somatic pathway. Remember, somatic refers to motor. So the neuron cell body is going to lie within the central nervous system, either the brain or the spinal cord. We're talking about motor right now. And then one single myelinated axon is going to extend from that brainstem or spinal cord out to the skeletal muscle. Just one. It's crazy. So then you've got your target muscle, and this neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, you guys should be familiar with it, is released, and it causes that muscle contraction. Okay? So one neuron's doing this job, and it's going all the way from the central nervous system out to that target organ, which is the skeletal muscle. So now let's look at the autonomic pathway, not the somatic pathway. This is different. So in the autonomic pathway, you've got a myelinated, so one that's got myelin on it, preganglionic neuron is going to extend from the brainstem or spinal cord, and it's going to go out to a structure called a ganglion. Okay? So this would be the ganglion. Here you got the neuron that's going from the spinal cord, it's myelinated, out to a ganglion right here. Okay, so you got one neuron right here. And so this one's called the preganglionic neuron. Okay? Next, in the ganglion, it's going to synapse with a second neuron. And this is going to be called the postganglionic neuron. And so the neurotransmitter acetylcholine is released right there in the ganglion, and it makes the postganglionic respond, and then the axon of the unmyelinated postganglionic neuron extends to the target organ that it's trying to talk to. Okay? And so the neurotransmitter released varies though at this point. So parasympathetic fibers will release acetylcholine at this point, and then sympathetic fibers will release norepinephrine. It's another neurotransmitter we haven't talked about. So the difference is that the autonomic pathway requires two neurons, a preganglionic and a postganglionic, and it also differs by having two neurotransmitters, acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Okay? So the somatic pathway is going to have one neuron, and it's going to only have one neurotransmitter, which is acetylcholine. So why are there two neurotransmitters? Okay, so one is considered excitatory and one is considered calming. So remember, in our autonomic nervous system, we've got two different ways that we can respond. And so this is basically the subdivisions here, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic division prepares the body for activity, and the parasympathetic division calms the body down. So have you guys ever heard of your fight or flight response? Right? So this is where the sympathetic division is called on in times of stress or times of anger or fear. So let's say that we've got some sort of monster lurking around the corner, and we're in a dark, scary room. There's a monster in there. Our heart's going to beat faster, right? Our breathing rate's going to go up. We're going to start sweating. All of a sudden, this stuff just starts to happen to us. This is the sympathetic nervous system responding to our fear and making everything kind of ramp up and get excited. Our pupils are going to dilate. And so basically it's preparing our body to either fight off this monster or to take off and run away, right? But you're getting ready for it. So both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions work at the same time, okay? They're working in balance with each other. And they're providing a background level of activity that's called autonomic tone. So right now even your parasympathetic and sympathetic are responding, just working together to keep things where it needs to be. So the balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic activity constantly changes depending on what your body's needs are. So now let's look at this. This is going to be a little bit, well, I'm going to actually go back to the slide or the iPad a little bit here. And so these two divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, also differ on where our neurons originate. Okay? Remember, there's always going to be two involved, but where they synapse in the ganglion are going to be very different. So the sympathetic preganglionic neurons begin within the spinal cord of the thoracic and lumbar regions. Okay? Let's actually start writing this stuff down on the board. So sympathetic, so preganglionic originate in thoracic and lumbar regions. So this slide right here depicts one side of your body, but of course understand this happens on both sides of your spinal cord. You got it right and the left side. So the neuron bodies in the spinal cord reach their myelinated axons to the sympathetic ganglia that's just outside of the spinal cord. So it's pretty short. The preganglionic neuron in the sympathetic division is really short. And the ganglion, that big bundle where it's going to synapse on the second one, is just outside of the spinal cord. It's right next to it. So these preganglionic neurons, they don't just synapse with the first ganglion they encounter. They can also travel up this ganglionic pathway. So let me actually give you a visual of this on the iPad. It does a fairly good job of showing this. I'll stop turning. Oh my gosh. trying to get it to move up with my fingers, but it's being super touchy. There we go. Okay. Alright, so I'm going to remove the bones. Okay? And I'm going to add one more layer of nerves. Boom. Okay. So now let me zoom in and let's look at this thoracic region of the nervous system. Let me see if I can find the ganglion. Bam, right there. See that? So these are the ganglion for the sympathetic nervous system. So like I said, these preganglionic neurons are going to leave the spinal cord depending on where their spinal nerve departs, right? And it can synapse directly in that ganglion with the next one, or it can go up. It can go up and down this pathway as well, just depending on what it wants to do. So the preganglionic neuron can basically go to any postganglionic neuron that it wants to. And this is how our fight or flight response is so immediate, because it can just travel real quickly. So then the unmyelinated postganglionic fibers, the ones after the ganglion, will leave the ganglia and then they're going to extend to the target organs. And those fibers are long. So in the sympathetic division, the preganglionic fibers are short and the postganglionic fibers are long. So let's write that down as well. So preganglionic originate in thoracic and lumbar. Pre are short, post are long, and they can, so the pre can synapse with any post because of that chain. Okay, let me go back to the slide now. So our adrenal glands, they sit right on top of your kidneys. You got two kidneys, they're kind of right back here, and then you got these glands that sit right on top of them. They play a large role in this sympathetic nervous system response. And so, what hormone do you think the adrenal glands may release? Adrenaline, you got it, right? So what does adrenaline do to you? Get you amped up, right? What was that? Go crazy. Yeah, so another way, so adrenaline's also called epinephrine. Sometimes you'll see that term as well. So the sympathetic preganglionic fibers will pass through the postganglionic fibers will pass through the outer cortex of the adrenal gland, and they're going to terminate in the center of this gland. So they basically innervate deep into this gland. And this is where a mixture of epinephrine and norepinephrine are secreted into the bloodstream. And so the adrenal glands releasing this epinephrine or adrenaline is what helps prolong this sympathetic response for as long as we need it to get away from that monster or to fight off that monster. Then it all wears off, then all of a sudden you realize, oh wait, I'm bleeding somewhere else, right? Talked about that last time. Okay, so now let's talk about the parasympathetic and how it differs. So this is our calming autonomic system. This brings everything back down. So you can also call this one rest and digest. Sympathetic is fight or flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. So unlike the sympathetic division that arises from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord, The neurons of the parasympathetic division arise from the brain and from the sacral regions of our spinal cord. So let's write that down. So preganglionic originate in the brain and sacral regions. So different parts. So the parasympathetic fibers leave the brainstem by joining either the oculomotor, cranial nerve number 3, the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus nerve, all those nerves. And then the vagus nerve is actually responsible for carrying out about 90% of all of the parasympathetic preganglionic fibers. That's a biggie. Cranial nerve number 10. So the ganglia of the parasympathetic division reside in or near their target organs. So this is different. So the sympathetic ganglia, the little bundle where it synapses, right, is right next to the spinal cord, and it can go everywhere. But the parasympathetic, those ganglia are going to be actually at the target organs. So there's really only one place that it can go, that preganglionic neuron. Got it? And so it makes these preganglionic fibers really long and the postganglionic fibers really short. Okay? So it's going to be opposite of the sympathetic division. And so because those ganglia are more widely dispersed, the parasympathetic division produces a more localized response rather than the sympathetic division. When you are going through fight or flight, you want your whole body to respond, and you want it to respond right now, right? Parasympathetic doesn't really matter. There's no you're not worried about speed, and so it's going to be very localized. It doesn't give you this whole big body response, and so that ganglia is going to be in that very specific target organ. So let's write those out here. So the preganglion are long, post are short, and it goes to a very localized area. So let's take a look at this table here. It's kind of a summation of what we just talked about. Hopefully this can make sense if you look at it next to each other. So under the sympathetic division, it originates in the thoracolumbar region. The ganglia, the place where it synapses, lies in a chain alongside the spinal cord, has a short pre, a long post, and it employs mostly norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter, but occasionally uses acetylcholine. And this produces a widespread generalized effect. So we want to run away from that monster. We want to fight it off. We want every organ and muscle in our body helping us with that, right? Parasympathetic. This originates in your craniosacral regions. The ganglia lie in or near the target organs, has a long pre, short post, and it employs acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, and it produces very specific local effects. If you're digesting, all it needs to do is innervate and control your digestive system, right? Okay, which of the following is an action of the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system? I want you to think about these responses that you might have, that might happen in your body. Yeah. B. So parasympathetic is rest and digest. And so increasing your heart rate, not a big deal. Stimulating sweat glands, that happens when you're excited. Inhibiting intestinal motility, Inhibiting intestinal motility means that you're shunting blood away from your digestive system to your skeletal muscle so you can run away from the monster. And so constricting your bronchioles is going to be this response from your parasympathetic. If your sympathetic was in control, your bronchioles would dilate, you would be breathing a lot more air, and your increase in your breathing rate as well. Okay. All right. So this is going to get a little complicated, but I'm going to try, and I'm actually going to draw this out real fast so that you can kind of see a visual how all this works. Give me 1 sec. You guys can stand up, move around for a sec. We're almost done. Let me draw out this diagram. So we've got okay. So let's talk a little bit about those chemicals that are released from our neurons that promote those differing functions of excitatory and calming. Those are called neurotransmitters, right? So the neurotransmitter released and the type of receptor that is receiving that transmission is what determines its specific function, okay? So the autonomic nervous system uses 2 different types of neurotransmitters. We've talked about them. We've got acetylcholine and we've got norepinephrine. So fibers that secrete acetylcholine are called cholinergic fibers. And then fibers that secrete norepinephrine are called adrenergic fibers. So the effects of the sympathetic division last longer than the effects of the parasympathetic division because acetylcholine is disposed of more quickly after its release than norepinephrine is. So, yeah, we'll just start with that one right there. So if you look over on the board, you'll see the first section of a sympathetic division where you got your preganglionic neuron, and then occasionally the post, are going to be cholinergic fibers, meaning that they are going to have acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter. Okay, we're just talking about the preganglionic right now. Now, this neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, is going to have 2 different receptors that it can go to. Okay, so a cholinergic fiber is going to have 2 corresponding receptors. So the cholinergic binds to cholinergic and adrenergic binds to adrenergic. But the cholinergic receptors come in 2 types called the nicotinic and muscarinic. So weird words. Okay, so here's our 2 receptors for that cholinergic fiber. So the different types of receptors determine the effect that's produced by this neurotransmitter. So our neurotransmitter is acetylcholine right now, and if it binds to a nicotinic receptor, it will create an excited response. Now, if that acetylcholine binds to a muscarinic receptor, it's going to produce a variable response. Okay, could be excited, could be inhibitory. An example of this is when acetylcholine stimulates intestinal smooth muscle, whereby inhibiting cardiac muscle during digestion. Okay, so when we eat and we're digesting something, that acetylcholine is going to make the intestinal muscle active, but it's going to calm down the heart because it doesn't need to have a high heart rate at that point. So the opposite effect occurs not because of the neurotransmitter, because this is still acetylcholine, it occurs because of whatever receptor it's talking to. So that's cholinergic, okay? Now we've got adrenergic. So norepinephrine is the adrenergic neurotransmitter, and there's two types of receptors that norepinephrine can bind to. You have alpha and you have beta. And the difference is that alpha causes an excited response and beta causes an inhibitory response. So for example, the binding of norepinephrine to an alpha adrenergic receptor in blood vessels will cause the blood vessels to constrict. It's activating that muscle. But the binding of norepinephrine to a beta adrenergic receptor in the heart or the skeletal muscle will cause the vessels to dilate, so it's relaxing that muscle. Okay? So both alpha and beta receptors contain subtypes that can cause exceptions to these principles, but for now let's just memorize these basic concepts. So let me show you this chart. I'm going to draw this out as well. Okay. So sympathetic division, we've got part of it started over there on the board. Cholinergic fibers from the preganglionic neurons will secrete acetylcholine. Acetylcholine binds to a nicotinic receptor in the postganglionic neuron. Now that can go two different ways. Most postganglionic neurons are adrenergic and secrete norepinephrine. But occasionally a postganglionic neuron is cholinergic and it will secrete acetylcholine. So, let's do this. This is confusing. So right here, this would be the postganglionic neuron. And this could go to also adrenergic or cholinergic. Now, this is, you know what, I'm not even going to do this. This gets really confusing. What I want you to know, okay, it's just, I want you to know that the neurotransmitter can do two things. And it depends on the receptor that it's talking to on what it does. And I want you to know which one's excitatory and which one's inhibitory. So for instance, ignore all this. Okay? I want you to know that nicotinic and muscarinic respond to cholinergic, which is acetylcholine. Okay? Nicotinic will be excited, muscarinic will be variable. Okay? And you've got adrenergic, which is norepinephrine. This is going to go to alpha or beta. Alpha is excited, beta is inhibitory. Got it? Simplified it? All right, write this down. So the parasympathetic division, so these two slides kind of show you how this applies to the different divisions, but what I want you to know is this, is that I want you to know that the two neurotransmitters are norepinephrine and acetylcholine, what fibers those associate with, and which ones of those receptors will make it excitatory and which one receptor will make it inhibitory or variable. Got it? Cool. All right. The effect produced by neurotransmitters is ultimately determined by? You got it. Type of receptor. All right. Okay. Whew. Chapter 10. It's a lot, right? So let me stop this video here.